"Sir, I'm gonna have to ask you to step away from the display." Her voice was sharp, flat, like she'd rehearsed this line 1,000 times, and every time it cut deeper. She didn't even look at him when she said it, just turned slightly, crossed her arms, and shifted her body to block the shelf of limited edition cufflinks he'd been examining. Before Dr. Ellington Ray could even respond, she reached forward and, with an unmistakably deliberate flick of her hand, slammed the display case shut. The sound echoed like a gavel in an empty courtroom. A moment of stunned silence followed. No raised voices, no chaos, just the quiet shame of being dismissed. She leaned in, eyes narrowing slightly. "You people are always curious, but never actually buy," she whispered with a smirk so slight it could have been mistaken for customer service. What she didn't know was that the man she'd just humiliated was on the verge of acquiring the entire luxury conglomerate behind this store. New Camden's Westbridge district sparkled under the soft winter sun, its glass buildings catching light like prisms. The flagship Lucent Atelier boutique stood prominently at the corner of Hazel Ridge and 5th, framed by two tall, leafless sycamores and a rotating valet line of Blacktown cars. Inside, everything glowed in cream, gold, and glass, artfully curated to whisper wealth. That afternoon, the air was hushed, perfumed, and brittle. Dr. Ellington Ray had slipped in unnoticed, wearing his usual navy suit and cashmere overcoat. Nothing garish, just polished, understated, intentional. He had only stopped in on a whim, on his way from a board meeting at the University Medical Foundation. The store was nearly empty. A couple browsing watches, a sales associate folding scarves, and Claudia Whitmore, store manager, style dictator, gatekeeper of elitism. She had scanned him as he entered, her eyes making a quick judgment. Expensive coat, yes, but no appointment, no show foreshadowing behind. And above all, black. Something in her froze. Ellington had grown, used to coded reactions. He noticed the shift in posture, the sudden politeness that felt like a wall rather than a welcome. But this was different. She didn't just ignore him. She corralled him, herded him away from anything she deemed too exclusive. As he moved past a case of men's accessories, she materialized beside him like a security tag. "That collection is reserved for clients by referral," she said crisply, eyes flicking toward the front desk like she was calculating how quickly she could get him out. He didn't protest. Not yet. He just observed quietly. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened, but it never stopped stinging. And what made it worse, what made his chest clench, was that even now, after building a global biotech firm, after raising $200 million in Series C funding, after lecturing at MIT, he still wasn't enough for people like her to see beyond skin. He had founded Renova Biotech 15 years ago in a borrowed lab space in downtown Chicago, when gene editing therapies were still a dream. He was 30 then, fresh out of Johns Hopkins, stubborn, brilliant, and broke. His father, an old-school science teacher from Atlanta, had warned him, "Excellence won't protect you. They'll still see what they want to see." Ellington had nodded, pretending he believed otherwise. But now, standing inside a store that advertised timeless elegance for the world's finest clientele, being treated like a trespasser, he heard those words again. He didn't come here to make a scene. He just wanted a gift. Something special. Something symbolic. His team had just announced a breakthrough treatment for spinal regeneration. He wanted to mark the moment with a token, but instead, he'd been offered humiliation, served on a velvet tray. And somewhere between her smirk and the sting behind his ribcage, he knew this was no longer about a store or a tie clip. It was about something bigger, much bigger. It wasn't the first time someone had looked at him like that, as though he'd wandered into a room meant for someone else, someone more predictable, more acceptable. It had happened at country clubs, at investor summits, at five-star hotel receptions. But there was something uniquely cutting about being judged in silence. There were no slurs, no outright insults, just that quiet icy reclassification, a glance that stripped away the titles, the degrees, the accomplishments, and left only what they were willing to see. And it always started the same way: a pause, a flicker of uncertainty, a narrowing of the eyes, as if the world had to squint to make sense of a black man in a space they didn't expect him to be. Today, it came in the form of a locked display case and a whisper behind a smirk. But for Ellington, it triggered a memory he never entirely outran. His first presentation at a venture capital pitch competition, 15 years ago, when a moderator mistook him for the catering staff. He'd smiled through it, made his pitch anyway, and later won the grand prize. But the applause that night never erased the moment he was asked to refill the water pitchers. He didn't need to make a scene to feel the weight of what had just happened. It had settled on his shoulders like dust. Fine, invisible, but suffocating over time. He stood still, hands tucked gently into the pockets of his coat, eyes scanning the room, not in defiance, but in quiet inventory. Who had noticed? Did they see what she did? Or worse, did they agree with it? His breath slowed, not from calm, but calculation. There was power in stillness, and he had learned, long ago, that silence could be louder than rage. Let them think he was too polite to fight back. Let them think he didn't belong. People like Claudia were always too sure of their assumptions. They never paused to consider that the man they were shooing away might be the very person writing the checks their corporate salaries depended on. She couldn't see past the skin. That was her failure. But Ellington was watching everything. Her posture, her tone, her comfort in control. Not because he was angry, but because he was documenting. Internally, precisely. She had given him something today. Not what he came for, but something he would use. His father used to say, "Dignity isn't something you wear, it's something you carry." Ellington had clung to that phrase more times than he could count, especially in rooms where eyes followed him not with curiosity, but with quiet suspicion. His father had taught biology for 30 years at Booker T. High in Atlanta, never missing a day, never raising his voice. A man of principle, a man who believed that excellence, real excellence, had to walk hand in hand with restraint. He remembered watching him iron his shirts in silence on Sunday nights, saying, "No one can question a man who shows up prepared." But even his father, as disciplined and steady as he was, had moments where the weight of being underestimated left bruises no one could see. Ellington once found him in the garage, just staring at a worn-out chalkboard, a red marker in his hand and tears in his eyes. He never asked why. He didn't have to. Some humiliations didn't need explanation. They just stayed, quiet passengers in a life built on perseverance. And today, Ellington felt one more climb aboard. He took one last glance at the cufflink display, the same one that had been slammed shut as if his presence alone was a threat to its value. There was no longer desire in his gaze. No need to buy, just the quiet, final note of dismissal, his own. He turned without a word, walking toward the glass doors as Claudia straightened her blazer, as if resetting the stage after a disruption. But as his hand touched the handle, a woman's voice called out from behind, "Dr. Ray." It was soft, surprised, familiar. He turned. Marissa Liu, his communications director, stood just inside the doorway, holding a leather folio. She looked from him to Claudia, her eyes narrowing. "They're ready for you upstairs. The team from Solvang Group just arrived early. Boardroom C." A silence fell over the boutique like frost. Claudia's expression tightened, unsure whether to smile or apologize. But Ellington offered neither. He simply nodded to Marissa, then paused just long enough for their eyes to meet. "Let's not keep them waiting," he said, and walked out. Not with vengeance, but with gravity. Because now, it wasn't just about her. It was about everyone watching who'd learned to carry dignity through closed doors. On the surface, it looked like a misunderstanding. A store manager protecting expensive merchandise. A man browsing without an appointment. A few clipped words exchanged. Nothing overtly aggressive. Nothing legally punishable. And yet, Ellington knew this wasn't about protocol. It was about perception. Claudia hadn't asked for his name, hadn't offered assistance. She'd simply decided he didn't belong. The moment she saw him, she categorized him. An internal switch flipped. Not a client, not a professional, just another risk to manage. It was what academics call implicit bias, but what Ellington had lived his whole life as an unspoken warning. The rules change depending on who you are. If he had entered the store wearing a hoodie, it might have drawn suspicion, but in a tailored coat and pressed slacks, he posed a different kind of threat, the kind that disrupted assumptions. He wasn't where she expected him to be. And that, to someone like Claudia, was more unsettling than if he'd been loud or unruly. His very presence contradicted her script, and people rarely react well when the world stops following the story in their heads. The luxury retail world had long operated under unwritten rules. Who gets acknowledged, who gets watched, who gets served with warmth, and who gets screened in silence. It wasn't written in policy manuals or staff memos. It existed in body language, in pauses before greetings, in the direction of a glance. Claudia didn't invent this system. She was simply fluent in it. And like many others in her position, she had learned to trust her instincts. Instincts shaped by years of exclusionary culture dressed as taste. Ellington had seen it before. Black customers followed more closely, spoken to less warmly, offered fewer high-ticket items. Not because store associates were instructed to discriminate, but because somewhere along the line, they had learned what a real customer looked like. And no matter how much wealth, poise, or prestige she carried, his face still triggered their internal alarm bells. It was a kind of curated blindness, an elegant form of erasure, where someone could be present, impeccable, and still be rendered invisible. 4 black professionals, especially those who had climbed high enough to enter elite circles. The discrimination didn't always come in shouts or slurs. It came in subtler, quieter forms. Delayed acknowledgments, questions that wouldn't be asked of others, credentials second-guessed, even after introductions. And each moment chipped away at something internal. Not confidence. They'd earned too much to doubt their worth. But dignity, the kind that eroded slowly when you're asked to prove your place again and again. Ellington had spoken with other executives who shared the same exhaustion, adjusting their tone to seem less assertive, choosing their wardrobe carefully to avoid looking too flashy, staying quiet when insulted because speaking up might cost more than it fixes. It was a mental tax no one talked about. And worse, it was often dismissed by those who didn't experience it. To them, Ellington's treatment in the store might seem like a harmless misunderstanding. But to Ellington, and to millions like him, it was yet another reminder that access doesn't guarantee acceptance. What happened inside Lucin Atelier wasn't just about one employee's poor judgment. It was a reflection of a deeper flaw embedded in the luxury world itself. A world that praised innovation but feared disruption, that celebrated global diversity in marketing campaigns but resisted it at the door. Ellington's presence didn't fit their template, and so the system reacted the only way it knew how, by rejecting the anomaly to preserve the illusion. The irony, of course, was that people like him had built the very futures these brands claimed to champion. He wasn't asking for special treatment. He was simply asking not to be erased, and perhaps that was the greatest threat of all, because when dignity walks in unannounced, it challenges the architecture of privilege. It forces a reckoning, and this time, Ellington had no intention of walking away quietly. That evening, Ellington didn't post a statement. He didn't tweet a thread or call for a boycott. He simply made a call to his legal counsel, then to his team at Raynova's Strategic Relations Unit. He requested a quiet review of Lucin Atelier's corporate structure, its affiliations, and its executive stakeholders. Within hours, a report landed in his inbox. The boutique was a flagship property of Aurelia Lux Group, a holding company whose public ESG commitments stood in sharp contrast to what he'd experienced that day. Ellington didn't need revenge. He needed a mirror, something that would force the brand to see itself without the polish. He drafted a private letter addressed to the Verellia board. Factual, restrained, and precise. It described not just the incident, but the pattern it reflected. How brands often celebrate inclusion from the outside, while quietly practicing exclusion within. He wasn't demanding an apology. He was demanding an audit, a culture review, a confrontation with the comfortable blindness they had curated for decades. And when he hit send, he didn't feel anger. He felt clarity. The story didn't break because Ellington wanted it to. It broke because someone in the store had been paying attention. A junior associate, likely in her 20s, had seen everything, from the locked case to the icy dismissal, and later confided in a friend. By morning, the incident had made its way into a private business leadership forum, then into a consumer equity blog, and finally into national news feeds. Black CEO denied service of luxury boutique became a trending headline, but the story itself carried more weight than any clickbait title. Other executives, men and women of color, immigrants, first-generation founders, began sharing eerily similar experiences. Boardrooms, lobbies, galleries. The pattern was too loud to ignore. Rainova didn't issue a public comment, but the silence only deepened the gravity. Ellington's composure became part of the story, the man who didn't have to speak for the world to hear him. And in that silence, a movement stirred, not in protest, but in precision. Consumers began tagging Verellia's partner brands. Investors began asking questions. And behind closed doors, the boardrooms began to sweat. Ellington had no desire to become a symbol. He didn't wake up craving headlines or hashtags. But as the story gained traction, he saw an opportunity not for fame, but for function. He organized a closed-door summit, just 30 seats, handpicked, CEOs, COOs, venture capitalists, and equity firm leaders from underrepresented backgrounds. The goal wasn't to vent, it was to strategize, to turn shared frustration into actionable influence. It discussed supplier contracts, board nominations, partnership leverage. One black founder suggested a public scorecard for luxury brands, tracking equity benchmarks the same way sustainability scores had once begun. Another proposed an alliance, a coalition of consumer-facing businesses that would collectively refuse to contract with brands failing internal diversity audits. Ellington listened, contributed, but mostly facilitated. This wasn't about his boutique incident anymore. It was about the system that allowed it to happen in the first place, and how to redesign it from the inside out. 2 weeks later, Ellington finally stepped onto a stage. It was at the Future of Commerce Forum in San Francisco, an event he had been scheduled to keynote long before the incident. Cameras buzzed with anticipation. Reporters lined the aisles. But when he spoke, it wasn't with anger. It was with clarity. "We don't want special treatment," he said. "We want consistent humanity." And in too many rooms, that's still seen as a disruption. He didn't mention Claudia. He didn't mention the store. Instead, he spoke of the architecture of assumption, the way systems reward familiarity and punish difference. He challenged companies not to apologize, but to audit, not to issue statements, but to show metrics. And when he left the stage, the room rose. Not in outrage, but in recognition, because in that moment, he wasn't just a CEO, he was a mirror, and every person watching had to ask themselves who they were when no one was filming. Ellington didn't change the world that night, but he made it harder to pretend it hadn't already started shifting. The boutique incident may have seemed small to some, a single store manager, a brief exchange, a door closed too quickly. But that moment held a mirror to something far larger. The quiet ways bias embeds itself into routine, the daily choreography of who gets seen and who gets sized up. For Ellington, it wasn't about a cufflink case. It was about the architecture behind the case, the decisions, assumptions, and silent calculations that stacked up to say, "You're not supposed to be here." And while his story made headlines, it echoed the stories of so many others whose names never would. Stories that never went viral, that never reached a podium, that ended with someone walking out a room a little smaller than they entered it. What happened to him wasn't unique. That's what made it unacceptable. There's a particular kind of resilience required to walk into spaces not built for you, and to do it again and again, knowing you may not be welcomed, knowing you may have to prove your worth before you're even acknowledged. That resilience isn't loud. It doesn't always wear medals or make speeches. It looks like poise in a silent lobby, like grace in the face of dismissal, like remembering who you are when the room forgets. Ellington's story reminded the world of that invisible labor, the psychological endurance of showing up with dignity where dignity is not freely offered. And for many watching, wasn't just inspirational, it was familiar, because they, too, had held their breath in elevators, softened their voice in boardrooms, adjusted their tone to match a version of themselves that made others comfortable. But change rarely comes from comfort. It comes from discomfort met with courage. And this time, courage wore a navy overcoat and said nothing at all, until the silence spoke louder than words ever could. No system changes overnight, and no one person can rewrite what generations have layered into the foundations of business, fashion, or society. But every system, no matter how polished, relies on people, on habits, on choices, and that means it can be unlearned, rebuilt, reimagined. The question isn't whether racism still exists in luxury retail. It's whether we have the courage to name it when it hides behind fragrance and marble floors. Whether we will question the quiet rules that govern who gets followed by security and who gets offered champagne. Whether we will choose comfort or truth. Because discrimination doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. Through body language, through pricing assumptions, through that pause before saying hello. And maybe the real work isn't in calling it out once. Maybe the real work is in training ourselves and our institutions to recognize when it's there in the silence. Ellington never returned to the store. He didn't need to. What he carried out that day was far more lasting than any purchase. It was proof that grace under pressure still matters. That quiet strength can ripple louder than outrage, and that when injustice meets dignity, it doesn't always explode. Sometimes it holds its ground and waits for the world to catch up. This story wasn't just about race, or class, or luxury. It was about recognition, about choosing every day to see one another fully. So if you're watching and you've ever felt unseen, this is for you. And if you've ever looked through someone instead of at them, this is your moment to pause, to ask yourself who you are when no one is watching, and who you choose to become when someone finally is. 3 weeks later, in a quiet glass-walled HR office on the 18th floor of Aurelia's global headquarters, Claudia Whitmore sat stiffly in a leather chair. The air was too cold, the silence too perfect. Across from her, 2 senior compliance officers wore expressions so neutral, they bordered on robotic. One of them slid a crisp document across the table without looking her in the eye. Effective immediately, he said, "You're being reassigned pending internal review." Her fingers tensed around the envelope, but her voice caught before any words could form. She flipped the page over, expecting legal jargon, maybe an apology for the confusion. What she saw instead made the breath leave her lungs. The letterhead read, Varelia Executive Oversight Council, and at the bottom, stamped with finality, was the name that made her stomach tighten. Dr. Ellington Ray, Strategic Equity Advisor. Her eyes froze. Her mouth parted slightly, but nothing came out. He hadn't called her, hadn't written, hadn't uttered a single public word, because he didn't need to. He hadn't just sent a letter weeks ago. He had already been inside, quietly, strategically, and now she was on the outside of a system she never realized he had the power to shape.